Good morning. My name's Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm very pleased to be here this morning. We have Ron Granieri, who's no stranger to any of you, as well as Marisa Porges, the head of the Baldwin School, who's going to be talking about her new book, What Girls Need, and how that relates to national security. So Ron Granieri, who I mentioned, was previously the host of Geopolitics with Ron Granieri, and has a new series. This is the inaugural episode of People, Politics, and Prose, which is Ron's new series. Ron's the director of FPRI Center for the Study of America and West. He's a Templeton Fellow. He is also a history professor at the U.S. Army War College. And therefore, I have to definitely stress that his comments here today do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. Before we get started, and I turn it over to Ron, I want to remind everybody to go to the Q&A button and put your questions in there, not in the chat screen. This is a new updated, fancier version of Zoom. So put your questions in the Q&A area. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our supporters, donors, and members for their generous support for this program. Without that, we couldn't bring these events to you. So thank you for that. And also to those of you who are joining us who are not members of FPRI, please do consider joining us. We need you, we want you, and you will enjoy being a part of FPRI. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to indeed the first episode of FPRI's new series, People, Politics, and Prose, our program of conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri of FPRI, and it is delightful to have you with us. We live in a world where relations between men and women have both made progress and leave much to be desired. Women receive about 57% of all bachelor's degrees in the United States, though only 18% of the degrees in computer science. Women make up roughly 47% of the US workforce, yet only lead 5% of all Fortune 500 companies. If we seek a society of greater equality of opportunity, we need to confront both these numbers and the visible and invisible barriers that continue to shape the careers and futures of women. Our guest today, Dr. Marisa Porges, is the author of a new book, What Girls Need: How to Raise Bold, Courageous, and Resilient Women. And she's made the most recent contribution to this discussion, in which she argues that parents and teachers, quote, must prepare children from an early age to recognize, refute, and push back against the gender biases and discrimination that are still a daily reality for women around the world, to be honest about the particular gender-specific challenges that our girls will face when they're older, and work to better prepare our young women to tackle these realities. And so we're here to talk with Dr. Marisa Porges, who is the head of school at the Baldwin School outside of Philadelphia, a former Navy aviator and former White House fellow. Dr. is a graduate of Harvard with a doctorate from King's College London, and has served as a senior advisor for cybersecurity and technology policy at the National Economic Council. Prior to joining the White House, she was a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and at the Council on Foreign Relations. In these roles, she's traveled throughout the Middle East and Afghanistan, conducting research on counterterrorism before taking up the job as head of school at her alma mater. So what do girls need to succeed and lead? How should schools and society as a whole help them reach their potential? These questions, and yours, will guide us in conversation with our guest, Marisa Porges. Welcome, Marisa.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for having me. And I think the one thing that we didn't mention in the bio is I was also and still pleased to represent FPRI as a senior fellow and a member of the board of advisors. So
indeed.
Thank you guys.
You would think I would have. You think I wouldn't have left that out, but I did manage to leave that.
That was for me to talk about. So thank you.
So Marisa, what do girls need?
Yeah. Gosh, is that a loaded question? You went right for the heart of it. You know, so the crux of my building, I mean, the book was inspired by what I'm seeing each and every day at Baldwin, right? And it was a combination of that and the lessons that I learned in the front lines of the military, serving overseas in Afghanistan, working in Yemen, at the White House, and then returning to see in a school context how we're educating and discussing and raising the next generation. And I think what girls need, if we're thinking through the lens of the next generation of future leaders, is both an honest conversation about the challenges that women still face. You mentioned some of the statistics, and I think there's a lot more out there in terms of things that we can be doing and thinking about to bridge that gap. And we need to start earlier by having honest conversations and by giving our girls the skills that will be their competitive advantage when they're adults. And it's too late to start when they're 20s, when they're, out in the working world. I think for those of us on the call, for me personally, I've learned a lot of those life lessons when I was out in the real world. And I think that we can start earlier so that we can build the muscle memories that our young girls need to succeed later. So I think those are all the things that I know we'll dig into some of them during this conversation, Ron, but I think that's the general premise. And I'm excited to work with parents and teachers and other leaders to help raise this next generation of young women.
Well, and you talk about adaptability as a key virtue. And your story is one of the different paths that one could take, right? That people might not have expected you to end up as head of school at Baldwin, but at the same time, everything that you've done has contributed to get you ready for this job. And so how do you, because you mentioned it in the book, but how do you, in conversation with your students, how do you talk about the way that your own life experiences have helped to shape your career in a world where so much of education seems to be focused on trying to identify the specific technical things we need to teach students to succeed?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of the interesting, outcomes of my own research that led to the book was this idea of if we move away from some of the technical skills, this idea that it's a certain computer science language or a certain language or certain, the core skills are needed, but it's how we teach our girls to think, how we teach our kids to think, and how we teach our girls to apply their knowledge that will really make the biggest difference. Adaptability being one thing. And we can speak to that in terms of what actual adaptability looks like and how to teach it. But it comes to this idea that my own lessons, my own stories are those lessons we need to share, but everyone has it. Every parent listening, every educator, every adult in a young girl's life has a lesson on a daily basis that we can share with our girls. So this for me came to the forefront during leadership class that I lead for our seniors. And I started telling them about a moment in Afghanistan when the core skills of leadership came to the fore because a colonel that I was serving with did the kind gesture of the selfless gesture of, handing me the calling card to call home and call home when I arrived to call my mother, right? It was this random moment that stuck out to me. And when I talk about it with the girls and I talk about, well, what happened next in Afghanistan and how I navigated the trials and tribulations of being on the front lines as a young woman doing solo research and all the things that unfolded. And I come down to this moment between two people that was about how we support our colleagues, how we support those working for us, how we mentor, how we think about building family and community, even in a work context. These are things that resonate with young women, right? It's how our girls are raised to think socially anyway. And when we think of it through the lens of, no, it's actually a leadership strength. It's a leadership skill. How do you then apply it as a teenager to your sports team, to your, performing arts club? Suddenly a light bulb goes off for them and they think, wait a minute, I can do that. I think that way. I do those things. All of us have those moments. And right now we have more opportunities than ever to share them with our girls because for most of us, we're stuck at home with our kids, with our teenagers, with our preteens. There's more of those interesting aha moments that we can share and just be honest about also our failures. And we'll speak to that when it comes to adaptability and resilience. And I know that's on our conversation list too, Ron.
Sure.
Because those are the even more important moments that we need to share with our girls to help explain to them how they can build resilience and build adaptability skills early on.
Well, and since you talk about, speaking with your teens and preteens, I can say that speaking with a 13-year-old can be a challenge unless you only want monosyllabic answers. And so I'm curious about the specific role that that teachers have in drawing out students who might not feel comfortable talking about things with their parents, or might just get embarrassed when their parents ask them a question, but might actually answer it when you ask them the question? And how do you, how do you, both in your own experience, but how do you encourage your teachers to engage your students in conversations?
Yeah, so it's such a critical skill that I think we're all missing now more than ever, for those who are having virtual learners at home, and sort of realizing the gap that our teachers fill in the social emotional growth and the executive functioning skills and how our kids communicate with each other.
Yeah.
We can talk to that from a parenting perspective at the end for those who may have remote learners at home. I think this is about role modeling. One of the most important things is to remember little things make a big difference, and that our kids, especially our young women, sop up everything they do in here, right? Everything, they see in here. And, you know, it struck me most when I was interviewing one of the students in my school for the book. She's now off at college. And I asked, you know, sort of, you're now pursuing entrepreneurship, but you also are applying this love of writing to entrepreneurship. It's a strange, you know, combination. Where did that come about? How did you even, you know, think of it? And she remembered a comment that her dad made when she was in elementary school, when she was in second grade, who said, yeah, you're really good at writing. Let's talk about that. And sort of complimented her writing and talked about an essay and talked about his own writing skills. And here's where I think the gap comes, right? Here's where that bridge comes, rather, to your point of how do you help bridge a gap, particularly in the middle school, teenage, preteen, early teen years, where, you know, the kids are most likely to give you monosyllabic answers. I think there's two things to think of here. One is about changing the question you're asking. Right? When you ask the question of what happened, you know, sort of the things that can be answered in a yes, no, you're going to get a yes, no. Right? But if you go
that is so true. Sorry.
Right. I mean, it's an easy, we're all here and we all know, and that's what happens in the car ride home. But if you think about really what you value most and what you want to get out of the conversation, for our young women, it's how they handle moments of struggle and challenge, how they pick themselves up and learn resilience, how they learn to raise their voice. So instead of asking, you know, the yes, no, perhaps it's what type of, for online learners in particular, did you use the chat or the hand raise on Zoom today? How did you ask your question, right? It can't be answered yes, no. What did you do when you worked with when you had a problem with your lab partner, right? And so now you're digging into the you know, we all know the outcomes don't matter, but we're reinforcing what they're hearing us say. And they're saying, oh, it's the how I raised my voice that matters, because that's the important thing. It's how I navigated a challenge with my lab partner or a partner in a project that really matters to my parents, to my dad or my mom, right? So that's one thing. And the second quick thing is to start finding easy ways of just building into your conversation, sort of the tools that make those awkward moments a little less awkward. One thing that I've heard families do that works really well, and that some of the kids I interviewed as well mentioned in different ways time and again, was something they do on the car ride home or around the dinner table called thorns and roses, or highs and lows, or blips and hurdles. And it's this idea that failure is a regular daily part of life, particularly hard for girls who are perfectionists to understand. But when we say, yeah, and this is where role modeling comes back in. As a parent, my rose and thorn, my thorn yesterday was hitting reply all to an email of colleagues and, you know, and sending the wrong thing to masses of people, or hitting too quickly a send to my boss, or whatever it is. We all did it, right? We've all done that. But my rose was, you know, something cool I saw outside, a walk with the dog, something you said from school. And then you have them take a turn. Right? Again, an easy way to build into the daily conversation. And it's awkward the first few times, but suddenly the kids get used to it and they know they have to, and it fills the car ride home with a little bit of a space that they don't have to think too hard about other stuff too. So again, easy ways.
I'm going to take you up on that, and I'll report back later on how that works. I want to ask you a question about role modeling, though, and this is the decision to write a book like this. And do you think that society puts too much pressure on successful women to be role models? What can the rest of us do to actually be, especially to be role models to younger women, right? What can the rest of us do to be role models and carry that responsibility too?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's something a lot of women take onto themselves. I know that every, you know, office I've stepped into where I've been one of few women at the table, I've looked around and thought, well, I need to now step into it. I think persons of color think the same thing when they're in a room and they're a minority in the room, and they think this is my moment to represent a community who's been underrepresented. And hopefully that will, over time, as we close the gap, diminish. But even so, you talked statistics earlier on, right? We think we've come so far in the political sphere. We now have, once again, a woman on the ticket for general election. And yet in legislative body, only 25% of our legislators are women. Still around the country, around the world, only 19 out of 193 countries have heads of state who are women, right? And again, and it gets worse and worse when you sort of look at in other areas as well, in terms of statistics. So I do think we have to look at other role models. But I think this is where we don't have to make role models. The role model doesn't have a capital R and a capital M around it. Role models come in everyday ways, right? Every woman on this call is a role model for a young woman in their life, because it's about how we navigate everyday challenges. Every one of us, I can speak for myself, but I say, the historical norms that have long provided little everyday challenges to women in and out of work on the home front, even the sense that domestic workloads get unevenly divided still to this day. And it's just how we navigate them. It's how I navigated the moment in my own career where I realized that the safety equipment that has been designed for naval aviators was designed with men in mind. And so if you're not the average height and weight of a man, and I'm on Zoom, so you can't tell that I am petite, and actually that the ejection seat I was flying in and the safety equipment that I was wearing wasn't built for me. And I had to sign a waiver that said, if it didn't work, I want to sue the US military, right?
Is that right? That was their solution to the problem?
That was the solution to the problem. I didn't tell my mom that when I did it. I think it's an afterthought now in the back of the book. But and that's an extreme version of what is an everyday reality for a lot of adult women, whether in the working world or on the home front. And I think it's using those moments and being honest with our girls and saying, whatever you do next, you're going to face everyday challenges for decades more. Well, the system is and will continue to change. We can't overlook that. But it's about the attitude and the skills that our girls need to meet those moments head on and say, this is how I'm going to tackle it. This is how I'm going to not let it get in my way.
Interesting. So I have a question already coming in from the audience. Mark Jacobson is asking, he's the father of a young boy. His question is what do our boys need to do, or what can we do for our boys to help girls get what they need? Yeah. How do we deal with that both? And I'm thinking that both is sort of adult grown-up boys, but also how do we actually help our boys with their classmates to play the right roles?
Well, I think thank you, Mark, and good to have you on the call. I appreciate it. It's been a long time since we've been in touch and seeing each other in person. So thank you for being here today. I think this is where these honest conversations about what we're seeing out in the real world are, kids today are more precocious than we even imagine. And they see what's going on, but they need to have adult conversations about it earlier and earlier, age appropriately, of course, but to point out what we're seeing and be honest about our own responses to it, right? And in everyday ways. This isn't a macro thing. This can be distilled down to an every way. The US Open just ended, so I'll use that as an example, right? That the moment when we, 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago now, when we saw Serena Williams, sort of talk back to a ref on the court at the US Open. An incredibly powerful moment in a lot of ways, right? And not all things went well for any of the individuals in that, and Serena was at fault in some ways, but there was also gender norms at play. And something that was on social media, was on the news, was, most of our kids, anyone who played sports, had read about it, and they were eager to talk about it, right? And I actually had a conversation with the teenagers, the upper schoolers in our school, and we said, hey, and then we looked at video footage of it, and we looked at comments, and we read an op-ed about it or a blog. And it was just a conversation of, why do you think she responded this way? Why do you think the man responded this way? Could it have been handled differently? What does that look like through different people's eyes? And these conversations can be handled earlier and earlier, right? Even when we ourselves, maybe it's a moment when you find yourself wishing you hadn't talked over a colleague. Statistically speaking, women get talked over in open fora vastly more often, even at the Supreme Court. A study was done at the Supreme Court 2 years ago, and the female Supreme Court justices get interrupted, statistically speaking, vastly more than male Supreme Court justices, even by the counsels who, if you've, for those who've argued in front of the Supreme Court, the lawyers are not supposed to interrupt their Supreme Court justice when they're speaking. And yet the men still interrupt the female justices. And it's a strange moment, but we have everyday things that we can point to in that. And we say, and I think honestly, talking about those moments with our kids is an aha moment they need to think, well, what do we do differently? What would we do if we were in that situation?
Right.
So hopefully that helps Mark. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, no, I think that's very good. That you use the U.S. Open is that it also happens, as you probably noticed as well, right? There was this year in the U.S. Open, Novak Djokovic had a temper tantrum and was forced to default. Mm-hmm. And I saw at least one place where somebody pointed out that the exact same sports writer who had written a column critical of Serena for losing her temper, wrote a column this year saying that Novak Djokovic was unfairly punished for a temper outburst, as though we're supposed to understand it when a guy does it, but when a woman does it, it is unseemly. I have not known if that sports writer has been forced to confront that contradiction or not.
Oh, that's so interesting. You just gave me an op-ed idea. Thank you. But that's exactly
You're
right.
welcome.
And so finding that moment, it's on TV all the time, and we'll have more of them coming up with the debates that unfold during the upcoming election. Right here we have, we've seen it historically that women politicians, the critiques around what they wear, the sound of their voice, the intonation of how they speak, those oftentimes get commented on much more often than the substance, and more often than what their male counterpart is wearing or how they're talking. And it's just something to point out, to understand that it's happening. And then more for our young women to say, okay, well, what does it make you think? What does it make you feel? And how would you respond yourself in that moment? And this is where they put themselves in the shoes and they start practicing the skills and the muscle memory they need when they're older. And that's, I think, what we do with our girls in class and what we ask our teachers to do at Baldwin, but all adults should be thinking about it for the next generation.
Absolutely. So we have a question from Lou Padulo about your experience going from Baldwin, which was single sex, to co-ed Harvard. And I'd like to piggyback on that with the bigger question is, what role do you think that single sex education can play in helping girls to develop into leaders, and what is the role of the continuous existence of single sex education in our broader educational system?
Yeah, it's such an interesting. I love talking about this question. This could be a whole talk unto itself, but I won't do that for today. Particularly in this day and age, right? So schools like Baldwin have been around for decades and centuries, right? We're 130 plus years old. And there's always the question, is it still necessary now? Have we entered a post-feminist era when we don't need single-sex schools? And yet you point to whether it's the Me Too movement or the front page of the Washington Post any given day when there's something about no longer the Redskins, but the Washington football team is reported on, or the everyday experiences of women in so many work environments, to say, yeah, there's still a need to teach girls maybe a little differently, think about how they need skills to develop and be their best self and their best leaders. And then there's the research, right? The research that shows things like when you take in a co-ed environment, especially at elementary school, young boys are more likely to raise their hand and speak out, answer a question or interrupt 3 times as often as a young girl. And when you take that young girl out and you put her in a single sex environment, whether it's a play date or an after school program or a school, she will speak out and speak up and raise her hand just as often as her male peer, right? You look at information that says girls opt out of competitive sports by middle school twice as often as boys do. And yet those C-suite executives you spoke about earlier, Ron, over 90% of them played competitive sports in college or in high school, right? Because we all know that being competitive is something that's good. It's healthy. It's what you need to, survive, and whether it's in the real world or going for your first job or first apartment. Sure. These are all things and ways of that girls' schools, single sex schools, after school programs, summer camps, there's a lot of places that we can find opportunities for our young women that allow them to be in an environment where they can focus on themselves and be with educators, adults, program leaders who are focused on girls specifically and what they need at different ages along the way. So again, it's research-based. It's based on what we see in the paper every day. It's also based on my personal experience, which I didn't get to in that answer, but I can.
That's what I was going to ask. So do you remember, because the truth is, right, even though you went to Baldwin, it's not as though you never interacted with a member of the opposite sex, right? And so when you showed up at college, it's not like you looked around and said, oh my gosh, there are boys here. And yet, do you remember any moments during, say, your freshman year at Harvard where you suddenly realized, this is why I'm glad I practiced this at Baldwin so I could do this here?
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I think that is the truth, right? It's not like you're in a bubble, not in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the skills that I learned, the core skills outside of reading, writing, and math, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So great. Those are things we need to make sure our kids have. And
Right.
It's a way of thinking, but it's also the skills of how to speak up, know yourself, and personally raise your voice that are the most important skills that our girls need that are grown in single-sex environments.
Mm-hmm.
One of the girls that I interviewed who graduated Baldwin a few years ago and is now off at college, she can remember being in her first co-ed classes in college. She's at Princeton now, and often she can say that she knows how to raise her voice in a co-ed environment, because she learned early on the muscle memory that comes with it. It's a skill you have to learn, right? And everyone has a different way of doing it. That muscle memory it takes to know yourself, know how to present yourself, how to communicate effectively. And it's not about helping, having our girls be more like boys, but it's about having them figure out for themselves what feels most comfortable. Right. How they speak, how they communicate, how they write. And those are skills that we need to give our girls early on. So for me, I think it came out most when I was in the Navy. Mm-hmm. Right. In those moments where, sure. I have to say, I had the good fortune of going to Harvard and I studied physics there. So I was in a lot of male dominated environments, but it was, a place where while there was historic norms in a lot of the places the math and science and other classes I was in, there wasn't an unwelcoming atmosphere. Right. When I entered the Navy, it was I wasn't the first to fly jets off aircraft carriers, but there certainly wasn't very many of us. Right. On an air wing of about 200, there was 4 of us flying jets and 4 of us flying helicopters. And I was a navigator. I was a backseater. I was Maverick to Goose that'll age us all in the room. The girls at my school do not get the Top Gun reference. So I'm working on that with them. But for everyone in the room here today, I hope you know that reference. It is a place where there was still a lot of differing expectations when you walked into a room as a woman. It was sure. Those moments that not just the equipment, but the expectations, someone saying flat out when I started training, you're not going to make it because you're a girl. Or, well, they must have given you the girl slot because I guess we need that now, right? Some idea of it was a quota. And I relied on not the skills I learned at Harvard or in grad school, but the skills and ways of being competitive in a healthy way and owning it. Right. A skill of how to speak up and speak out when I needed to, either to make my point heard or to defend myself if I needed to. This idea, but also of how to problem solve. Our girls have different ways of problem solving that are particularly unique and reinforced socially in a gendered way that makes it an advantage for us. And I can say I was better at some group problem solving, whether it was in Afghanistan or in my Navy squadron, than some of my male peers. And it was something that then they learned to turn to me for, right? And so here you have it as an advantage we can give our girls later on. So I think, I'll learn all those skills when I was young, from an early age and at an all girls environment at Baldwin.
Right. This actually gets to a complex combination of things, because you do say in the book, right, that girls do have this advantage in empathy and collaborative problem solving. And I wonder, right, do you think one of the reasons why girls are undervalued in the workplace, women are undervalued in the workplace, is that American society chronically underappreciates precisely those values? That's one question. But then the flip side of that is you also have a chapter where you talk about nurturing a girl's competitive spirit. And how do we create a society where people's competitive spirit can come out when it needs to come out, but that we can also nurture empathy and collaborative problem solving? Since, at least at first blush, those two things can seem to be pulling in opposite directions.
Okay. Those are great questions. I'll take them in the order. So empathy standpoint, you're right. This is an area where if you look around the world, leadership has been tending this direction. They've done interesting studies about what employees value in their bosses, what teams value in their colleagues, what companies value in their leader. And over time, what have been historically called feminine skills, feminine traits, things like empathy, things like how you communicate, things like collaborative skill sets are more and more important. It's the places people want to work. It's the skills that people hire for. And there is a bit of a lag I think in the US environment because they've been considered soft skills that don't sort of have the same bottom line impact. And yet, CEOs and C-suite executives around the country actually admit in a recent study that empathetic thinking drives positive bottom lines. And so you look now, and there's over the past decade, many more corporations, both old school and new school, I'll talk to some traditional ones and some newer ones, that teach empathy to their employees because they think it's better for customer service. Empathetic thinking, being able to understand your customer, take their perspective and help you as a employee help solve the customer's problems, that's going to drive sales and product, and positive profit line, right? The Ford Motor Company, they actually started teaching incoming engineers better empathetic thinking skills by making them wear what's called the empathy belly. It's actually a suit that's modeled after a third trimester pregnant woman that allows an engineer to feel what it's like to physically carry be 9 months pregnant. And then they have to get in and out of different cars, get in and out of the cars that they're trying to redesign, feel what it's like to put the seatbelt on and off, to navigate a low or high entrance point in a truck or a sedan. Because the company realized they needed their engineers to empathize with their customer and better design the cars. There's actually a lot of examples where this has become core to how leaders are thinking. So I think, Ron, we're now seeing a changing era in what will be not just valued behind the scenes and in studies, but in our common lexicon for what we hire for. And I'm hoping we'll see that in nonprofit and political spheres as well. And so that it'll sort of reinforce what our girls, what comes naturally to them a lot of ways because of social norms and how they're raised, so that they can lean into it as leaders and say, no, this is my advantage. I'm good at empathizing. I'm good at communicating through an empathetic lens, and that makes me valuable.
And then what about the competition side of it?
Well, so this is one where I'll push back and challenge you on the idea that competitive having a competitive spirit or being competitive is in opposition to empathetic thinking or is anyway a bad thing. I think competitiveness has gotten a bad rap in sort of modern society, modern parenting, modern schooling, because I think we're getting maladaptive competitive spirits, right? This idea that it's competing against all costs, it's cheating to win, that sense, or that winning is bad because someone had to lose. I think that is not what we're talking about, but healthy competitive spirit. Competition has been shown to make you perform your best. Studies from the late 19th century show that when an individual runs against another person, whether or not they win or lose, they perform their best. Study with school kids show that when they're competing against somebody else in math problems online, they did something that was like basically a combination between an Xbox game and flashcards and a math class, and middle school students performed better when there was a competitive element to the game, even if they didn't win. But it makes it fun. They're sort of energized to do their best. They're focused. And I think this is something we want to reinforce with our kids, particularly our girls, because young women, unfortunately, have been by and large raised to think that competition is bad because, as we talked earlier, someone has to lose. What if it's a friend? Will they be embarrassed? Will they look bad? But we all know that being able to opt into something where you're judged against your peers, being able to perform your best, being okay whether or not you win or lose, and then picking yourself up again, is critical, whether you're going for your first job, going for your first apartment, running for political office. Again, an area where women, studies show, opt out when a political engagement is deemed competitive. They are more likely to opt out, where men continue to opt in and say, fine, I'll go for that election, even if it's competitive. All these reasons are why we need to teach our girls to be competitive. So I will push back in you on that. And I think there's easy ways we can do it for our kids too.
I like that. That's excellent. And because it's important to realize that when you're in a competition with someone, you are part of a community with them, right? Either you're playing the same sport, or you're participating in the same organization. So you can have a community spirit and that's why you should respect the people that you're competing with, right? Because it should all come together. And yet because those two things are often presented as opposites, they don't have to be. And so I guess to try to nurture them both would be better for everybody. I want to push a little bit broader, outside of, or both, perhaps even a little more abstract, I guess. And that is the relationship of how we educate young women to larger questions of civic education and national security. On a practical level, I'm curious, what does Baldwin have particular programs to encourage civic education among its students? So I'll start there. So what does Baldwin do to encourage civic education? So because you're encouraging people to find their voice because you want them to be active citizens.
Yeah, I think it's such an important part of the conversation today, particularly when you look at studies that show schools have tended away over the past decade. So, not a current administration issue, or sort of not very recent, but in the past 10 plus years have started to tend away from civic lessons, conversations about civic engagement. And it's an incredibly because we're trying to raise citizens. Right? We're not just trying to raise leaders, we're trying to raise citizens who positively contribute to their community in whatever way or shape or form that feels right. We've done it at Baldwin and in both overt and I want to say covert ways, but sort of subtle ways that sort of get woven into the system. We've done it by creating roles, right? We reimagined one of our staff roles into a coordinator of civic engagement, someone whose job actually is to think about how we help our girls and develop programs to integrate moments where our girls, it's not just service learning and volunteerism, but it's also understanding and getting engaged with community organizations, getting to understand politics, right? Not taking a political side on one way or the other, but how does it work? What does it look like? To be informed about voting in the process. I mean, these are things that there's actual programs and ways and organizations that schools like ours get involved in. We weave it into the curriculum as well, starting early on, right? I think this is where conversations with elementary students are really important, so that they're informed and educated about what they see when they're hearing stuff on social media, whether or not they have a smartphone yet, or whether or not we realize it. This is also where parents and the conversations they have at home are incredibly important. Those conversations, I saw someone write in our Quest Q&A about those conversations around the dinner table, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Pull that forward, particularly in now in the fall during an election season. Talk about that there is an upcoming debate, even if the kids aren't going to watch it, right? It's not age appropriate maybe for some of our younger girls, but how does it work? What does it mean? What does the political system look like? What are the three branches of government? We all remember that enough to know that even that baseline, the cognizance of what that means, and then this understanding of how we get involved in the conversation. And this is where, one thing that is important for girls especially is to help them raise their voice in a way that feels personal. For me, it actually took a while, despite Baldwin, to really feel empowered at some of the tables I was around. I can remember one story that I share in the book was my first meeting, my first time with the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, in a meeting in the West Wing, where the cliche of the cat got my tongue totally unfolded. Embarrassing to say, particularly to a hometown crowd. But yeah, that time when we were talking foreign policy, counterterrorism, national security, and with, my pivotal career moment sitting at the table with President Obama. And I didn't say a word about the issues that were my expertise. Right. And I walked out thinking, why did I do that? Right. I had the good fortune of having a few more moments with him where I had one-on-one conversations about, how to combat ISIS and what that looks like and Al-Qaeda and the stuff that was my forte. But I don't want our girls to have that moment. And yet we want them to feel comfortable in their own shoes. That for some of our girls, introverts, not about being an extrovert, but it's about finding other ways to speak up, other ways to be engaged in the civic-minded mindset that we want our kids to have. One of my students, her thing is change.org. Petitions that with, adult oversight, parents at home, something easy that our kids can do from, age 10 on, right? With you signing on and helping. And her big issue was hedgehogs as pets. For those who are based in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, I bet you did not know that hedgehogs are actually illegal as pets in Pennsylvania. That had been the pet she thought she was going to get as her first pet in elementary school. Easy pet, we all thought, but lo and behold, illegal. So she started a change.org petition, online, easy, and with her parents' help, emailed it to the friends and family, right, colleagues of her parents, and got a couple hundred responses, and then sent it to her state legislature. And before you know it, was getting emails back from her state representative saying, we have a bill moving forward. There's actually was a bill last year on the floor of the state Senate for Pennsylvania. It did not pass. She was disappointed to hear. But nonetheless, here you have this moment, this way, in a kid, age appropriate moment, in a way that didn't require her not feeling comfortable in her own self, in her own shoes as an introvert,
right,
to practice getting engaged in her community and as a civic-minded young woman.
I'm going to try not to derail the conversation.
All right.
One of these days we're going to have to talk about, so what's wrong with hedgehogs? Is it because they are burrowing creatures and they're going to destroy people's lawns? I'd love to know the rules behind that.
That was, no pun intended, that was not the rabbit hole I went down in my research, so I'm not sure. We'll look into it, Ron. I'll get back to you. I'll ask her. I will have her send you her petition. How's that?
That would be fantastic. Thank you, Marisa.
But here's also a moment, right? An easy, small way that I'm now going to get to reinforce with this young girl. Hey, adults are interested in what you're talking about. Like, let's congratulate her for her voice, and I look forward to sending you her little one-pager on why hedgehogs shouldn't be a problem.
I'm looking forward to that, because that's really good. Well, then let's, to dig out from underneath that particular story, but to get into something big. All right, I had to do that. Sorry, but Secretary of State Clinton famously said, right, that women's rights are human rights. And what do you see as the connection between gender equality, between respect for women as adults, women as citizens, and larger national security questions? In the sense of, how should the United States, for example, both think of itself as whether it's either modeling or not modeling proper procedure here, but what does it mean to deal with states that do not respect those rights in the way that we would like to think that we respect them?
Yeah. And here's where we get to the crux of obviously my career to date and what we work on at FPRI and what we're so interested in. And there's a couple different directions you could go here, right? You could go to the research that shows that in communities and countries where women have a larger voice, a vote, but also economic empowerment. Those countries are places where the next generation does better, where education educational access expands for children, where you see more consensus building. It's a reason why in the context of Afghanistan, when I was there doing research and we were looking at Taliban reconciliation efforts, right? This question of how do you get women involved in the conversation in a country where for so long they'd been formidably and for all purposes structurally left out.
Right.
And yet both on the home front and with the next generation, those are the voices that really have the largest impact. And you can, look at it in terms of something we started talking about in terms of consensus building, collaborative problem solving, this idea that just naturally, innately, those skills come more naturally and easily to young women. A sidestep here for a moment of, again, data and research, a recent study by the OECD with 125,000 kids, 15-year-olds, teenagers around the world, 52 countries, showed that girls outperform young boys when it comes to problem solving in teams. They performed on average 30 points better, than boys, and were statistically speaking 1.8 times more likely, if I'm going to get the data right, to be considered top performers in this problem solving skill. This, how do you find consensus in teams? How do you navigate challenges in a problem in groups, right? Again, all these reasons why the hashtag arguing the future is female, I think it actually serves the world well, because that's where a lot of the problems what we're seeing now play out are going to get solved. So to get to the second part of your question in terms of what does it mean for us as a society, us as a country, us as an organization, FPRI or other think tanks or the people on this call, I think it's about doing two things. One, having this honest conversation we're having now, not just in these circles where it's a little maybe preaching to the choir because we're all logged on and interested, but in other places where we can be honest about the systems that need to change, that to allow for more women to have access to these opportunities and to grow into leadership roles. And then it's to put our, the euphemism, money where your mouth is, but in this context, it's about how we vote. It's about how we choose role models and leaders, in our own organizations, about how we mentor and sponsor people in our own lives, and about making sure we are looking at it through a gendered lens. Right, that it's not past the time where you have to say, hey, I'm in my own company, in my own organization, in my own classroom. Am I calling on women equally? Am I having women have a seat at the table? Am I inviting women into that most important project where they will get the experience and exposure they need to then, shortly become the leaders we need in the future to do just what we talked about early, which is, to really set the stage for societally where we need to be. So I hope that gets at the answer. It doesn't get to maybe the governmental.
It does, but I'm sorry, I'm going to
Please
talk
go.
over you there. But yeah, but what I was just thinking, especially with the Afghanistan question, especially right now, as we know that there are talks going on in Qatar right now today, I guess, between the Taliban and the Afghans, and this may not be completely fair, but I'm going to say it. And that is, there are those people who are arguing that the time has come to make a deal in Afghanistan to end the American involvement, which I could totally understand. And that one of the arguments that is somewhat presented is we, the United States, just have to give up on trying to encourage the Taliban to treat their women any differently. That somehow the question of women's equality in Afghanistan is a luxury that the United States, after 19 years, we've got to just sort of shrug our shoulders and say, hey, that's up to the Afghans. And I guess because what concerns me about that is, of course, there are limits to how much the United States or any state can encourage a society to change the way that it treats its own people. But what does it say when the United States of America basically says, man, that's just too hard to do, so we're just going to walk away from that idea altogether, considering how much we talked about this in, say, 2001, 2002, 2003. Yeah. What do you think about that?
So it's such an interesting question, and I think it plays out at a lot of different levels and a lot of different moments in terms of how we're looking at systemic change, particularly gender norms we're trying to change, not just in Afghanistan, but in our own country, right? Sure. Or, sort of in other places that feel like they should be moving more quickly. And this is where I think it's very context specific. And I think two things can be kept in mind. One is this idea that sometimes moving slow to move fast is something that, is a valuable outcome too, which isn't to say you give up on the overall goal, but there might be another way to get there, right? Another way to get from A to B, right? And this is the joke we used to say when I was serving in the Pentagon was in the DOD, in the Department of Defense, you had enough military operators that it was all about getting from A to B, right? Period. Just tell me B and I'll get there in a straight line. And at the State Department, for our colleagues there, it wasn't about getting to B, it was how you got from A to B, right? And sometimes there's a step in between. And I think that's a thing to remember in this instance too. Particularly because there's other outcomes, both through the national security lens or through our own lens of how we're managing our soldiers and our sailors and what we need in navigating overseas engagements, to say, well, is there an interim outcome? Is it about having a certain number of women at the table? Is it about providing certain opportunities that we need to see as an interim step in a context, in a country, in a community where perhaps it's not about giving up the eventual outcome of what we want to see from an equality or gender norm standpoint, but about figuring out, well, how do we help get there with being honest with ourselves that there is moments when we can't do all things at once.
Right. So we will have to make choices, I guess.
I think so, right? These are the tough choices that I think come with any both complicated negotiation, but any really challenging problem, right? We're seeing that still today, right? And it's not just something in Afghanistan, but the tough challenges that I think we're facing in a lot of gendered environments. This idea that still to this day, let's look at a different context. Still to this day in America, the pay gap means that women make 82 cents on the dollar for the same job that's done by a man. And continuing to simply say this is how it needs to happen and look at it through one lens has stalled. right? We've seen gains made in the gender pay gap over the past 5 to 10 years significantly diminish compared to where they were in the decade before that, right? That we came to a point and then it sort of stalled out. All right, so is there an interim step? Not to say you give up on this idea that, yes, equal pay for equal work, but is there something else that will help us get there? Another way, not through the problem, but maybe around or moving to move the whole thing forward. So right. I think maybe that's how I'm thinking about it.
Well, and the question of interim steps is an interesting one. I mean, there's the, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked, right, how many women should be on the Supreme Court? She said, well, 9. Because she said we went for a long time with 9 men. Why can't we have 9 women? Right. That the issue of trying to and no society should think of this as something that has a finish line. We say yay, we've got to equality. Right. Let's pat each other on the back. So how should we without worrying about numbers, but how should we imagine a post-sexism world, right? How should we imagine a place where we've gotten this more or less right, assuming that we're never going to solve all problems to everybody's satisfaction?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and I think we're gonna have. I'll save some of this for the next. All of us get together for drinks in person.
You're on.
In some ways, it reminds me of a question I got earlier today from a member of the Baldwin community who said, "What does a post-COVID world look like?" And my answer was, I think we have an interim step to think about first before we get there. And I think I'm going to use the same answer for this one too, Ron, because, while we've come incredibly far, since in some ways, since Title IX or in the past 50 years, I don't entirely know if I know the answer to that, because I'm still looking at data, and the ones you quoted, 5% of CEOs are women, or 25% of legislators, or the fact that, again, when maybe a silly one, but for the women on this call, next time you're at your office and not at home, and you reach for the sweater in your purse or the scarf under your desk, pause and remember that it's actually because the air conditioning systems in almost every business building, every office building, is set through historical algorithms that is aligned with the body temperature of men, because the buildings were built and the algorithms were set by engineers who are men. And so we are cold for a reason, because our bodies run at different temperatures, biologically speaking, as a norm, right? That sounds like it's a totally silly one, and I'm happy to bring a sweater wherever I go. But I think there's a lot of places and ways that it's almost, I don't want to say too far to imagine, but I think the system has a long way to go. I think there's still things we need to teach the next generation of girls and boys. And I think one day we'll know it when this conversation changes, right? And when this conversation doesn't have 73 people show up in a week's notice at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. And when books like this,
there you go,
now available on Amazon with for anyone who hasn't picked up their copy. But when books like this aren't needed, right? We no longer have to have the conversation about, why is it our girls are seeing and feeling and being fraught with facing different challenges than our boys are.
Right. Well, and it's funny, because we do have one more question in the Q&A, which relates to this idea, is that some of the advice, when you talk about your experience at the White House, the issue of being relatively introverted, which there are women introverts and there are men introverts. How much is a society that values all voices and encourages all voices can offer benefits to everybody. Right. It's not just trying to, basically that it's about making people feel as though they are valued members of the community.
Yeah, well, and a diversity of voices is shown to drive profit bottom line, to make companies perform better, to make society answer problems better. Every question that we are facing as a society, particularly through the lens of international affairs and foreign policy, but when you also look at, so climate change, from that to Afghanistan to COVID, right? Those are problems that we need a diversity of voices on in order to solve. Or if you look domestically at economic inequality or political divisiveness, right? Any issue that the folks on this call are interested in are going to be solved by a diversity of voices that needs to include women. Right. But it is something that, to go to your question about the Q&A that said, well, what about boys who are introverts? I hear you, and yet, I would caution us to not overlook the societal norms of what is reinforced with boys and what's reinforced with girls, right? Because it does come down to some sort of tried and true and data sort of proven by research norms that, you can be an introvert and still speak up at a meeting and still put your voice forward. You can be an introvert and still, in a co-ed environment, have your idea put forward and reinforced by your colleague, because that's what happens by and large to men and boys in class, in schools, but also in the work environment, where girls are more likely to be interrupted and shut out, whether or not they're introvert or an extrovert. So there is just a gender norm that we need to be honest with ourselves about and help fix, I think.
Great. We are just about out of time. There is one really big question that just came up, which I want to ask, but understanding that we don't have a lot of time to get into it. And that is, how does the concept of gender fluidity and our greater sensitivity to gender fluidity, how should this affect our pursuit of gender equality?
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting one. And I think this is one that our concept as a community and society about how gender fluidity plays into our everyday engagements is still in early days, right? I think even the fact that we're having this question as part of this conversation today, and it wouldn't have happened even maybe 2 or 3 years ago, right? And so how does it look like in gender equality? I think it goes back to the same idea we spoke to just a few minutes ago. This idea that a diversity of opinions, that understanding different perspectives is the critical part of all of this, right? And because this is where we could also say it's, there's a conversation to be had about those, persons of color, the Black and brown students in my community, how we're helping raise their voices because they're facing different challenges as well. And I think this is something that will continue to be part of the conversation. I do think, by and large, there's still less research in terms of some of the things that skills or ways of being that I studied in the book and that we look at here at my school, or first, of course, that I experienced myself that I can't speak to personally. And I think there's still early days from a social science perspective in terms of the research there. And I think that will also help inform that answer in terms of, well, what does it look like and how do we help move that direction? So.
Right. Great. Well, Marisa, I'm afraid we are just about out of time. This has been terrific. Thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Marisa Porges, the author of What Girls Need, How Bold, Courageous, and Resilient, how to raise bold, courageous, and resilient women. It is available in bookstores now, and you should all go out and get yourselves a copy. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about it, Marisa.
Thank you for having me, everyone. And of course, these days, it's also online. So any place you go online or check out my website, marisaporges.com. There's some resources there from parents and educators about reading lists or things that you can do for your kids your girls to nurture some of the stuff we talked about today.
Outstanding. Thank you. And FPRI would like to thank our sponsors and partners for making this possible. We thank all of you for joining us here on People, Politics, and Prose, our first program. Please send us your comments about this program and all the programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. If you want to know more about what we're doing here at FPRI, you should become a member or a partner. But even if you've done that, please check us out at fpri.org. Follow us, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program at Ronald Granieri. We look forward to seeing you all next time. But until next time, for everybody here at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks so much.